What's going on, everyone? You're listening to the Asian MMA podcast where we talk about everything and anything going on in the world of Asian MMA. This episode is brought to you by my tardiness in getting this episode out. I apologize. I'm Dana Bluen, and this is your Asian MMA Weekend recap from May 24th to 26th, 2019. We start this recap in Japan, which coincidentally also happens to be where we're going to end the recap and also spend all the time for the recap. Pretty much the only thing we had going on this week was Japan MMA. But we start with Pancrase 305. And then we have some interesting news bits to cover from both RIZIN and DEEP Jewels. Now, I've got to say, Pancrase 305 was in fact a really good card. And I've been watching Pancrase since way back in the day, since I started watching MMA in the early 2000s, late 90s. And so I always really enjoy Pancrase on a nostalgia level. For me, it just sort of tugs at those heartstrings. I really love it. And I'm gonna put up the full results for Pancrase 305 on AsianMMApodcast.com so you can see the full results there. But first, I really want to talk about the main event, where we saw Isao Kobayashi unify the featherweight strap against a very game intern champ, Nazareno Malegarie. And this was a 5-round banger that had me on the edge of my seat the entire time. Now, going into the fifth, I had both of these guys winning 2 rounds apiece. So going into the fifth, it could go either way. And they both look good. I mean, I didn't know what was going to happen, but the fifth kicks off, and this is where Kobayashi turns it up, and he puts on the pressure to get the win, wins the round, wins the victory, ends up, unifying the belts. But I mean, just the fifth round, you don't know what's going on, and this is what MMA is. This is what you want the final fight, the main event on your card to be. I mean, the drama, the story that evolved during the fight. This is what a fight is. This is what it should be. And it was fantastic. I mean, for a main event, all the way through 5 rounds, like I said, edge of my seat. Could have gone either way. Fantastic fight. The other fight on this card that really stood out to me, it really was a great one for me, having been a fan of Asian MMA for so long, was a fight between 2 legends of the game, Yuki Kondo and Akira Gano. Now, both of these guys have careers going back to the 1990s. Right? They fought in the biggest organizations in the world: UFC, Pride, Shudo, Deep, K1, Pancrase. The list goes on. And just what an epic matchup to have on the card, right? To have this fight on the card in itself is just amazing. For it to be a Pancrase card is amazing. This is another one that went the distance. This went all 3 rounds. But, what we saw was what made the difference here for Kano was the pressure and the work rate. And that was the story of this fight for him. High pressure, high work rate, and that's what won him the decision. He ended up taking home the UD. But fantastic fight, especially if you're an old school fan of Asian MMA. This is a fight you wanted to check out. Now, moving on, this coming weekend, we have RIZIN 16, which this card looks to be really good. I'll be covering that, of course, in the next Asian MMA Weekend recap. So, be sure to check out next week's when I'll be covering that on the podcast. But they also announced that RIZIN fighter Rina Kubota, she'll be facing Lindsey Van Zant at Bellator 222 on the 14th of June, Madison Square Garden. This is going to be interesting for a few reasons. The primary one of which is this is Rina's first time fighting outside of Japan. Also, it's a huge stage, Madison Square Garden, a lot of history attached to that. But fighting for the first time outside your country in such a huge time difference, going all the way to the East Coast, it'll be interesting to see if that plays a role in this fight for her, because if it's a factor, it could really impact her negatively. Hopefully she gets there with enough time to sort of acclimate to the time shift, sort of get ready for that climate in New York. It's going to be summertime, sort of humid, maybe a little bit stickier than she's used to in Japan. But I mean, if she does well with the transition into the US, it's going to be a great fight. I think it's going to be really, really good. And of course, this whole Bellator card is stacked anyway. So I'll be checking it out no matter what. Now, in other news from Japan, we now know that UFC, RIZIN, and Pancrase veteran Rin Nakai will return after more than a year out of the sport. She's coming back at DEEP Jewels 24 on June 9th. Her opponent, well, this is kind of funny. Her opponent is 0-2 fighter Kiao Prachumwang. Both of her previous fights have been in Bangkok-based promotion Full Metal Dojo. Here's a little odd fact for you. I actually reffed her last fight back in 2017, which was a losing bid against Cambodian standout Tarat Sam. I hate to say this. I really don't want to say this, but it does feel like she's just kind of being set up to be fed to Rin as a tune-up. I hope that's not what it ends up being, but it sort of does feel that way. I'd like to see her pull something out here, but unlikely. They're also fighting at 58 kg, which I believe when I reffed Kiao against Tarat Sam, she was 52. So I mean, maybe she put on significant weight in those 2 years, but I guarantee you, Rin is going to be a jacked 58 if the fight's actually at 58. Anyway, guys, that is all I have for you today. To stay up to date with all things Asian MMA, be sure to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, YouTube, and Facebook. I will have all the links down in the show notes. Check it out.